and obviously it is a rewarding one, and we are back. So a big welcome, and next we'd like to introduce you our president, Mr. Berger. He's going to give us a little remark on this event here. Ben?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and our speakers, and also Councilor Mr. Cohen, and all our members and our potential members as well. Thank you to join our third business seminar during the week of small week for TD Canada Trust, and thanks so much for their continued support to make this success for the last 3 years. I think it looks like it's really just like happened 2 days ago, our first time. It's already 2 years ago. And now, and we have different topics each year to cover. Current issues about what our economy is going to be happening. And we are so glad to have Mr. Greg Alexander, the Chief Economist of TD Canada Trust, come and give us a overview and about what's going on in our economy in the coming year. And other than that, last year we talked about currency. We actually have around 200 guests. And last year certainly our fixed rose up so high and good for people doing import. This year, we think about limited export. And recently, the Canadian currency dropped 20%. How should we react with these sudden changes? And EC Export Development Canada come here to get us some insight about how they can assist small businesses with doing export. Export doesn't mean shipping goods outside. We serve our tourists. It's also a kind of export. So maybe you think you are not in the export business, but happens to you open a store in Pacific Mall, but you export because you export service to some foreigner. So it's also good value for you to come over here to see what happens, what you can do when the currency go up and down. Other than that, this year we will have 2 our directors. One is our past president, Mr. Daisy Wei. She is going to tell you how we can package ourselves to some marketing, your product. And our legal advisor, Mr. Ho, is going to tell you how to protect your business, how to protect your interests. Other than Canada, TD Canada Trust can make us happen here today, and also really to thank the venue provider, Sheraton Tower Hotel, and they provide us a nice place, so we can have a quiet, nice lunch to have available information afternoon. So I would not take you guys too much time, and hope you enjoy the lunch and especially the speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. The next, we'd like to welcome the remarks from Ms. Berger. She's the Area Manager of Business Banking, TD Bank Canada Trust. So let's all welcome Anne.
Thank you. On behalf of TD Canada Trust, I'd like to welcome you to the Richmond Hill Markham Chinese Business Association Small Business Seminar. My name is Anne Berger. I'm Area Manager Business Banking for TD Canada Trust. Small Business Week is an annual national-wide celebration of Canadian entrepreneurship and their innovative businesses that are key to our country's economic growth. Since its inception, since 1979, with the endorsement by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the growth has grown substantially in size and scope. TD Canada Trust is proud to be a major sponsor. TD's sponsorship during the week through the local businesses and trade associations in major cities across the country includes conferences, trade fairs, and seminars. It provides opportunities for entrepreneurs to network and exchange ideas, explore ways to innovate and improve, and responding to the changing demands of the marketplace. Small Business Week recognizes the efforts and contributions made by our entrepreneurs to to the national economy and acknowledges the importance of financial and consulting support for innovative and promising ideas. With offices across the globe, TD offers a wide range of product services to over 14 million customers worldwide in personal and business banking, wealth management, and wholesale banking. At TD, we understand, appreciate, and support Canadian small businesses tapping into these opportunities, be it locally or in overseas markets. TD is proud to be partnered with the Richmond Hill Markham Chinese Business Association in sponsoring today's event, paying tribute to Canadian small businesses as they contribute to the primary force in driving our national economy. With the changing environment, I would like to share a few key messages for managing small business in difficult times. Small businesses need to be prepared for factors such as slowing economic growth, rising inflation, and higher commodity prices. In this environment, companies must be ready to change gears to navigate through from rising costs to changing customer preferences. So how do you survive and prosper in a changing economy? Assess your business strategy. Business strategies that work during an economic boom may not be as effective in times of slowing growth and rising costs. Determine where your business is most vulnerable and focus your strategy and efforts on these areas. But do not focus only on today. As part of your strategy thinking, look for opportunities to become leaner, more efficient, and cost-effective. This will make your company more competitive when the economy recovers. Dealing with rising prices. Slowing economies and higher input prices do not always go hand in hand, but global growth is causing inflation in the form of higher prices for oil, agricultural products, and materials, at a time when the North American economies are slumping. In this scenario, it can be difficult to pass along price increases to your consumers, so determining where your company has pricing power, compare what your competitors are charging. Cut your costs. The way of dealing with rising input prices is to cut production and other costs, but be careful. A company can reduce capacity so much that it will not be in a position to capitalize on the next upturn. And if you cut it in other areas, such as product development, this can also hurt your competitive position in the future. Managing your cash flow. One of the leading causes of business failure is due to poor cash flow management. In turbulent times such as this, it's never more important to manage your money coming in as well as your money going out. Whether it's accepting credit cards with merchant service solutions or paying with business visa, getting money into the business quickly and keeping it there as long as possible is key to riding out unexpected shocks to your business. Many of your customers, especially if they are businesses, may take longer to pay than in the past, and some may not pay at all. Accepting credit card, diligent following up of outstanding invoices, and ensuring you have adequate credit in place before you need it are all key components in cash management flow. TD Canada Trust has products to help small business owners during difficult times, one of which is our new TD Canada Trust interest-only term loan. The loan defers principal payments for up to 12 months. It's designed for businesses who need to purchase equipment and machinery to help increase productivity or to reduce their environmental footprint. This gives flexibility and cash flow relief while the new equipment is being installed or tested. We'll expand on these products in a later presentation. I hope that you will find today's topics beneficial, and on behalf of TD Canada Trust, I would like to thank you for attending our event today.
Certainly a lot of information, and I would certainly encourage you to take some notes because we will have a Q&A session down the road for you. So ask any questions you think you might have. All right, the next thing that I would like to introduce is the sales manager from Sheraton Agway Hotel, Ekta Satay.
thrive in our neighborhood, and we welcome the opportunity to host events that bring the business community in Richmond Hill closer. We take this opportunity to assure you that we take extra care of all our guests and that we welcome and thank you once again to our hotel.
Good. We certainly like to thank Sheraton Parkway Hotel because she sponsored all this meal for us here. All right, so let's give her a big hand and thank her. Okay, we're going to start with the part one of this session here, and we have Brent Ryle, Export Development Canada, to give us some, to tell us or give us the fortune and see what he's going to bring for us.
Thank you. I'd like to thank RHMCBA for this speaking opportunity. And I'm not going to get too much into the economy, the dollar, price of oil. I think that message is best delivered by the speaker following myself, being Craig Alexander. I'm going to focus more on EDC and how we help clients, but again, I'm not going to speak product. I'd rather give an example of how we help small business. But before that, I should tell you, who is EDC? What do we do? EDC, that's our acronym for Export Development Canada. We are a federal crown, meaning that we're 100% owned by the Canadian government. For some of you in this room, you might deal with our sister crown being BDC, Business Development Corporation, for maybe some of your real estate or term loans, so we're very much similar to them. Our mandates are different. EDC's mandate is to support export trade. So any opportunity that you have that has an export component to it is potentially a transaction that EDC can assist you with. And then the question might be, okay, how do we assist you? I'm not going to tell you how to do the transaction, where to find the business. That's not our strength. Our strength is more on providing finance support for your export opportunities, mitigating your risk, being payment risk, or maybe asset risk if they're located in another country, and working very much with our banking partners such as Toronto Dominion Bank, that's the major sponsor here today, and working in partnership with them to help develop your export opportunities. Now about myself, I'm new to Toronto. I work in the 150 York office on the corner of Adelaide and York. I moved from the Prairie Provinces about 6 months ago. I run an account management team of 7 account managers. These are the ones that have the client-facing role that are in front of customers such as yourself on a day-to-day basis. I was in that role for many years. I was in the commercial banking role with one of the Canadian banks, and I was on the international trade finance side, so I feel I'm well poised to serve them and help them build and develop the relationship that they have with you. I must say, in coming from the prairies, that Toronto is really underrated. I personally really enjoy living here. Once I got over the sticker shock of housing costs and horrible traffic, and I found out those ugly-looking cats running around are really raccoons. So, but it's a very, very enjoyable city, which I've told my counterparts back in the prairies I'm very happy to be living here. Now, I mentioned I have account managers that are in these client-facing roles that I deal with on a day-to-day basis and help provide support to them to help you. Well, like in any other organization, sometimes we get caught short-handed. Maybe it's holidays, maybe somebody is sick, whatever the case might be. So there's an opportunity with a very good new client for EDC, and I was asked to kind of pitch in because account manager wasn't available, and I thought, hey, you know what, I want to keep on with these face-to-face roles, not just go with an account manager on a call. I'll just actually go and I'll get in front of the client and I'll see if I can provide some support here. Now, this was not eye-opening to me because I've dealt with many clients in the past, but I was just kind of curious. I thought this is my first client visit in Toronto, so I want to see what's different here. So I go to this manufacturing facility. They're in the packaging side, so they're a packaging manufacturer, and 80% of their sales are to the U.S. So I'm thinking, all right, you know, there's an export story here. 80% of their sales are into the U.S. market. How am I going to be able to help this company? So I want to get a bit of a story from them. So I meet with their new president, and I meet with their new CFO. And I'm thinking, new president, new CFO, and I just have my guard up a little bit already. Now the challenges that they have, and I hope not all of these are familiar, just some of them. Dollar was at par with the US dollar, this going back 3-4 months ago, and of course with their 2007 year end, it was pretty much a par situation where the Canadian dollar is very strong. So they had that as a challenge, of course, because all their production is in Canadian dollars, their sales are in US dollars, since 80% of their sales are there. Now, in packaging, one of their main inputs into their product is resin, and resin is petroleum-based. So now they're into this other problem where they're challenged that their commodity price was going up dramatically in 2007 and at the beginning of 2008 as well. So there's another challenge. Then I hear about a senior management issue where their former CEO was basically involved in fraud and embezzling money from the company. So I'm like, oh no, it can't get any worse than this. But then I hear, you know, I'm kind of looking at their old 7 figures, and there's a bit of a hole in the middle of the year. And I said, well, what happened kind of May, June, July? Oh, we had a planned fire. So that interrupted with our production. So at this time I'm thinking, your account manager is going to be back next week. I'll be happy to set up a meeting with him because I'm thinking, wow, there are a lot of challenges here. It's automatically in my head. You know, I'm thinking, how are we going to support a company like this? But also I knew that the ownership of this company, and much like many of you in this room, very smart, bright individuals, used to adversity, used to overcoming these insurmountable odds. But, and I knew this was going to happen in a quick discussion, there's actually a little bit more bad news. When we started talking about their financial position, we look at their financial statements, of course, because of the challenges I mentioned, they are losing money the last 2-3 years, kind of hand over fist, and the good equity base that this company once had was severely eroded. So, you know, I was kind of, my yellow flag is almost turning to a red flag as to, am I going to be able to support this company? But then there's always good news. We always look for that silver lining. I know TD Bank is very good at that as well. We try to look, is there something good here that we can grasp onto? And yes, the good news is that even though the equity was eroded, there was still very good security available. The owners of this company were still very supportive and willing to fight the good fight, put more money into the company, and most important to me, their bank was still supportive of helping this client and staying in the game and helping to see them through. So then I knew the crunch time was going to come, went through all this. What's the ask of this client going to be about all this bad news? There's a little bit of a silver lining. And I'm thinking, geez, I hope the request here is something I can truly help them with, that's not too unreasonable. And what they're simply, I should say simply, what they're looking for is additional credit to fund their export opportunities, fund their export sales, which were still robust and growing despite the current times 2 months ago in the U.S. and despite what's even going on today. So I thought, okay, the bank is still in the game here. The bank wants to help add credit capacity. EDC is in a position on the finance and working capital side that we work with our banking partners and say, hey, let's risk share. The simple example I'll give is if the bank decided, we'll stay in the game, this company needs an additional, say, $1 million to help fund their growth for additional working capital to get them to that next level, to assist them in their export opportunities. EDC will work with the bank and will say, hey, you know what, we'll take on 50 or 75% of that new financing risk if the bank will take on part as well. So we partnered with the bank to provide more capacity. Now the second thing that the client wanted, and I found this maybe a little bit easier, is a lot of their sales are concentrated with 10 clients in the U.S. And their concern was because of the current credit environment today, what if one of those companies were to tank? What if they all of a sudden were bankrupt? And this Canadian company has a very large receivable with that company. What's that going to do to their bottom line? How is that going to hurt their business? What could EDC do? And again, we're in the business of providing risk mitigation services. So we looked at those 10 clients that they sell to. We're comfortable with the risk that those 10 represented. And we basically insured their receivables, meaning if one of those companies fails, we will pay out 90% of whatever that receivable balance is. Which gives not only this company a good feeling, but it gives their bank a good feeling as well. Because then their bank knows if there's a significant hit on the receivable side, that the bank's position is still protected. So again, that was an easier part of the solution for us to provide, with the main being the financing support that we were able to put in place. So if I look now more at the good news side, and you heard what the bad news was. This client is growing. Their sales are expanding into the U.S. And we know that that's not the case with all companies because the retail environment is drying up in the U.S. market. So they're maintaining their sales base. They're even more profitable. They're starting to turn the corner even with the dollar at par. So now with the Canadian dollar hovering between that 80, 85 cent range, Craig will probably comment on that more, but that differential from 80 cents to a par dollar is going straight down the bottom line. The other challenge I mentioned was their resin, and the cost of that resin was petroleum-based, and that was always increasing and was a challenge for them. That resin has now dropped close to 30% in price for them. Again, that goes straight down the bottom line. And the last hope I have is because of oil going down in price, a good part of their expenses was logistics, which was freight for their product, and I'm hoping that will go down as well as the price of fuel is hopefully poised to reduce as well. So I guess my message is EDC can provide support if there's an export story to be told. Another part of my message is it's not all bad out there. But I realize not all stories are like the one that I'm telling, and there's a lot of adversity that's out there. But I know in my experience and through the bank and EDC that small business and entrepreneurs always find their way through adversity and always find a way to see through the more difficult times. And finally, if you have a good export story to tell, and you're looking for risk mitigation services or looking for ways that maybe you can increase your working capital, fund your opportunities, then I believe that yourself, your bank, and EDC really have something that we can start and talk about. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this opportunity. Good luck with your business and your business ventures.
The exporters is certainly, if I'm one of them, I'll be very excited, and I will be definitely looking for his business card, because $1 million coming along and only have to pay 10%. What a deal. Anyway, the next thing here is economic outlook for 2009. Aren't you all excited? The only person that can give us this vision, I would like to invite Craig Alexandra. He's the Vice President and Deputy Chief Economist of TD Bank Financial Group. So he is one
Small Business Week. And it is a pleasure to be back. I should apologize if some of you were wondering why things started late. That would have been my fault. For the record, trying to get from downtown to here in 25 minutes up the Don Valley in the middle of business day, it's not a very easy thing to achieve. But a little over a half hour ago, I was in downtown Toronto meeting with a trade delegation from China, and set up by the Chinese embassy. And all of the questions that I got from them about the economic outlook are all the same things I'm going to talk to you about. It just tells us that we're all in the same boat. Now, I really wish I had a more upbeat message for you. Last few years, I have been stressing to you the challenges on the export front, the issues in the United States, but the strength on the domestic Canadian economy. The reality is, I think the next 3 or 4 quarters for Canada is going to be quite difficult. I don't think we're going to have the same sort of strength that we had. There is nothing inherently fundamentally wrong with the Canadian economy. The reality is we're going to get hit by 2 very big external shocks. And the first one is the global economy is slowing down, and that's a challenge for exporters. The second thing is that the domestic side of the Canadian economy won't be as strong as it had been. But the other external shock is coming from the global financial crisis, which I'm sure you're all aware of. You can't help but notice it given the media coverage. So what I want to do is try to make a little sense of what's been going on and talk a little bit about what we think is going to come down the pipeline. So if we continue on. Financial markets have had unprecedented volatility, just unbelievable movements in the markets. In 23 of the last 28 days, we've had a triple-digit move on the TSX. This is unprecedented. A lot of the concerns on the global economy, on the financial markets, basically started off as worries about the global financial system. It started off as worries about the U.S. housing market, but very quickly it's cascaded into problems in the international banking arena. This is why we've seen bank failures in the United Kingdom, in Europe, and in the United States. In actual fact, the Canadian financial system has been weathering this storm phenomenally well compared to its international peers. But alas, we're still getting caught up in the storm indirectly. The reason is that banks in Canada generally take in deposits and they make loans, but the loans are bigger than the deposits. And so the difference between the two has to be financed. But banks, just like businesses and consumers, have to go out and borrow in order to finance their activities. And what's happened during the recent financial turmoil is the cost for banks to borrow has gone up. So even though central banks around the world have cut interest rates, the problems in the global financial system, in particular in the UK, in continental Europe, and the United States, have meant that a lot of financial institutions have very weak balance sheets. They aren't willing to lend as much to each other or to their customers, and as a consequence, the cost of doing business, the cost of borrowing between financial institutions has risen. And that really created a lot of stress on financial markets. The second part, though, is that more recently we've seen a very big drop in commodity prices and a broad-based global sell-off in equities, largely reflecting the fact that there is no expectations that the global economy is going to have a recession. Now, the original concerns really started off with the United States. And in actual fact, the United States is headed for a recession. Back in August, when we did this forecast, we expected that there would be virtually no growth in the third quarter, a contraction in the fourth quarter, and very little growth, for several quarters after that in 2009. But economic and financial conditions have been worse than we expected. I suspect now that we'll probably see contractions in the U.S. economy in the early part of 2009. So make no mistake, the U.S. economy is in recession. Now, a lot of the problems in the United States originated in the housing market, and the bad news in the housing market continues to roll in. And you can see that in terms of what's been happening to housing foreclosures. The catalyst for the housing market, for the U.S. economic problems, was that they had a housing bubble that developed, and the housing bubble burst. But an awful lot of the housing bubble was fueled by inappropriate mortgage loans and by imprudent lending practices, which weren't present in Canada. And as a consequence, the housing market correction in the United States has been very, very severe. And in fact, I would argue there's a lot more to come still. We think home prices in the United States probably will drop another 10 to 15%. And the reason is that while we have had a very big prices from their peaks. If we go and we look at where prices are relative to where they started the housing boom back in 2002, they're still actually well in positive territory. In fact, if we look at it at a city point of view, you can see that, for example, Los Angeles had 44% price growth. Well, now you've had a 26% correction, but ultimately that means that the market could weaken further. At the moment, there's about 10 to 11 months of supply of unsold homes in the U.S. marketplace. So if you think about that, what does it mean? It means that if no new homes were built, nobody else listed their property for sale, it would take you almost a year to sell off all the properties out there. So there's a lot of supply, not a lot of demand, and this is probably going to lead to further weakness in home prices. Moreover, the credit crunch, the problems in the financial system, is also going to make it difficult for the housing market to recover because banks have really cut back on their willingness to lend in the United States. In fact, what's happened is we've gone from a situation where during the housing bubble, we had a proliferation of something called, and you gotta love the expression, ninja loans. Okay, I like it because it conjures up an image of what the banker looked like on the other side of the table. But it's an acronym, and it stands for loans that were made with no documentation for income, job, or assets. So a lot of Americans were getting access to money that they never should have. Well, now the pendulum has swung, and it's swung too far. And now people that have income, have jobs, and have assets are having difficulty getting access to credit. And so fundamentally, before we can actually see an economic recovery, before we can have stability in the housing market, we have to see a resolution of the problem in capital markets. We have to see a resolution of the financial strains in the U.S. banking system. And up to this point, so one of the ways America was getting around the problem of their weak banks and the inability, the unwillingness to lend was to go to foreigners to borrow. But as you may have noticed if you've been following the financial press of late, the problems in the financial system haven't been just in the United States. In fact, there's been deep-rooted problems in the UK and in a lot of European banks as well. So ultimately, the problem is that, as I said, the cost of doing business, the cost of financial institutions to operate has really increased. So government interest rates, government bond yields, government interest rates, like the Bank of Canada overnight rate, they've fallen. But the willingness or the interest rates that banks are charged on borrowing for themselves in the market hasn't dissipated, or as you can see, the cost of credit to financial institutions is very high at the moment. This is why you have seen in recent weeks truly dramatic announcements by governments around the world. They have recognized the root problem, which is the weakness in the global financial system, and in particular, the weak balance sheets of some financial institutions. As a result, governments have kicked into high gear to address the root problem. And this is why in the United States, for example, the U.S. Treasury announced a $700 billion program. Now, it's hard to get your head around the concept of $700 billion, right? I mean, the number is so large, it's hard to grasp. To give you an example of how big a billion is, a billion seconds ago was 1957. Okay, so $700 billion is going to be channeled into the U.S. financial system. What they're doing is $250 billion of it is going straight into bank stocks. In other words, here, have money, put it on your balance sheet. This is building up their asset base. The rest of the money is going to be used to buy up these very poor quality mortgage-backed securities that the financial institutions are holding on to, which we're not quite sure what they're worth. So the government's going to buy them up so the financial institutions are much healthier, and then the government will basically liquidate the financial assets that they've bought up down the road sometime, probably when we actually know what they're worth. And so, in actual fact, as traumatic as these and as dramatic as these events have been, I would argue that we really are seeing governments address the root problem, and that is encouraging because it means that if their policies have the desired effect, the tide will start to turn. I would argue that there's really three stages to a financial crisis. There's the catalyst, the problem that erupts, and that was the U.S. housing market and the fact that, in actual fact, globally we had a credit bubble that burst. the second stage. And the second stage is all the damage that's inflicted. That was all the value of these mortgage-backed securities and other financial products that have collapsed in value. The third stage is the one we're in now. And that's where you clean up the damage that's been done. Now the thing about it is that the actions by the governments are extremely positive from a long-term perspective. Because if you think about, a good example is the experience of Japan in the late 80s and then the 90s. Japan had a housing bubble. It burst in 1989. After it burst, the consolidation of the financial industry didn't take place the way it needed to. Japanese banks were saddled with billions and billions of dollars of bad loans. And it took them a long time to basically write them off. And as a consequence, when the Bank of Japan cut interest rates to 0%, it had no impact on the economy. Because ultimately, although businesses and customers could get a zero interest rate loan, nobody was actually lending any money. So it didn't matter. And that mistake, the fact that they did not address the root problem in the system, which was the bad debts that were on the balance sheets, cost Japan arguably 15 years of economic growth and left them with a legacy of deflation. The actions that the European governments, the US governments are taking today, and to a much lesser extent Canada, are basically targeted the source of the weakness, and it's basically to avoid that sort of mistake again. So ultimately, we will get through this, but I would stress that government actions aren't a magic wand. They don't make the problem go away overnight. But what they will do is they will eventually have the desired impact. And if there isn't enough money yet, let me tell you, there's more going to come. Because you cannot have a healthy economy without a healthy financial system. And so I think this is going to eventually have the desired impact. But the problem is that the damage that's already been done can't be avoided. And so at least in the short run, even though 12 months from now I am convinced that the government actions will have had their desired impact, in the near term, over the next few quarters, we are going to see slowing economic growth. And I wish I had a better message for you, but quite frankly, you need a pragmatic assessment of what's happening. In the United States, one of the things that have been helping keep the U.S. economy's head above water, the reason why, in actual fact, the U.S. economy continued to grow in recent years, was the strength in exports. Well, going forward, we're probably going to see weak retail spending, weak business investment, but exports aren't going to be as strong as they were because the global economy is slowing down. Now, we got to keep it in perspective. China grew at 11.7% last year. It grew at 10% the first half of this year. The last quarter, they grew at 9%. 9% is a very strong rate of economic growth. In fact, it's 3 times as strong as an average pace of growth in Canada, when the Canadian economy is growing at a healthy pace. So 9% is very, very strong. But 11.7% down to 9% means you've lost almost a quarter of your growth rate over a period of 2 or 3 quarters. And when I was speaking with the Chinese delegation today, I was saying, during the summer I went on vacation. When I left to go on vacation, China was worried about inflation. And when I came back 2.5 weeks later, they were cutting interest rates because they were worried about growth. And it has been shocking how quickly the tide turned. How quickly the impact of a weak U.S. economy was felt in terms of hurting exports from China. Now, China's domestic economy is absolutely solid. But the reality is an awful lot of products manufactured in China find their way into the global economy, and an awful lot of them end up in American households. And so the export side is not going to do as well. So globally, China's economic growth is slowing down. India cut interest rates 100 basis points, 1 full percentage point this week, because their growth rate's slowing down. But again, the China-India economic boom story is still intact. It's just their growth rates aren't going to be as strong because of weakness in other parts of the world, and in particular the industrialized world. In Europe, in the United States, and regrettably, I have to say, in Canada as well. And the fact that global economic growth is coming down from 4 to 5%, an absolute booming rate of global growth, down to below 3%, has really impacted commodity prices. This is why we have seen oil prices fall almost 60% from their peak. Now, to be fair, last time I was here speaking to you a year ago, I said that there was going to be a 30% decline in commodity prices. Well, I missed it by an order of magnitude because oil came down 60%. But commodity prices have fundamentally gone way beyond where they should have gone. Oil prices probably should never, when global growth was at 4 to 5%, oil prices probably should have been in the $90 to $100 range, which is where they really started this year. The run up to $146 never made any sense. And I think an awful lot of it was related to speculation in the energy markets because of hot money, investor money flooding into commodities. So in a sense, there was an element of a commodity bubble, which has now burst. But the fundamental supports for long-term commodity prices are still going to remain intact. China is going to be, if you look at energy consumption in Asia, it's going to continue to rise. We are going to, when the global economy improves, you're going to start to see commodity prices come back up because at this point, it's now priced in all the weakness, it's taken out all of the excess that we had. Oil is going to remain at high levels, just nowhere near where we had them. And so today, oil is trading at around $65, which is a phenomenal drop from where it was. I think over the next 5 years, the average price of crude oil will probably be around $75, $80, which is about triple the average that we had in the 1990s. Now, the Canadian dollar is a commodity-based currency. It basically tracks commodity prices very closely. And so the big drop in commodity prices we've had has absolutely hammered the Canadian dollar. And actually much worse than we anticipated. The other reason why the Canadian dollar is falling, though, it isn't just a commodity story. It's also a story about strength in the US dollar. Because what's happened is during this period of pronounced global financial distress, people have fled to the safety of US dollars. Now, I gotta say, I think this is just absolutely perverse. Right? I find it, it's a real quandary that, given the problems that are originating in the United States, the distress in the US banking system, it may sound very counterintuitive that during this time of uncertainty, you flee to the US dollar. And yet that's precisely what's happened because the US dollar still is the world's reserve currency to a large extent. And so we have seen the US dollar strengthen to a 5-year high against the euro, 5-year high against the UK pound, a 3-year high against the euro. So the US dollar has strengthened. Now going forward, I think commodity prices, they could fall a little further as markets are negative, but I think they are going to stabilize and eventually will start to come back up a bit. I don't think you're going to see a lot of movement, so I don't think that's really going to drive the Canadian dollar. But I firmly believe that the strength in the US dollar that we're seeing today won't last. Because once the global financial turmoil abates, once these government actions have their desired impact, I think you're going to start to see the US dollar give up the gains that it's had. And in fact, in order to pay for their huge fiscal initiatives to basically rebuild the financial system, which is going to cost them trillions of dollars, the US government is going to issue a lot of government bonds, all US dollar bonds. And what that basically means is a big increase in supply of US dollars, which inherently, from an economic point of view, means if you have more supply of something, you're going to push down its value. So I think the Canadian dollar, which today is currently trading at around 78 cents, which is, again, I'm finding it hard to get my head around how far we've moved in such a short period of time. I suspect that by the end of next year, we'll probably be back up in the high 80s when the US dollar gives up its recent gains. But from a Canadian perspective, the challenge is that exports are going to remain weak in the near term. But I want to stress that from the point of view of the world economy, this doesn't mean that there aren't great opportunities out there for exporting. It means that exports in general are going to be weak, in particular exports to certain markets and in certain products. If you think about it from a Canadian perspective, Americans are not going to be buying cars, they're not going to be buying furniture or appliances, the housing market is going to be weak, that probably means weak demand for forest products. But if you're thinking from a global perspective, like China growing at 9%, India growing at 6%, there's still some export opportunities out there. The point is you have to be discerning about where you're exporting and who the customers are. In terms of the domestic side of the economy, the domestic Canadian economy has been really the key support in recent years. It's been actually growing at a really strong pace. Close to 5% in 06, close to 4% in 07. The bad news is I think it's going to cool down. I think it's going to come down to around 2%. The 2% is not terrible. 2% is basically, just a healthy pace for the Canadian economy is 3%, so 2% is a bit lackluster. It's not terrible. The point is it isn't going to grow the way it had been, though. Now, from a small business point of view, most small businesses are more affected by the domestic side of the economy than the external side. So we actually think small businesses, in many cases, are going to perform better than their large counterparts. Because if you're targeted more than the domestic economy, you're going to be more insulated. But the point is, the revenue growth is probably going to be weaker. And part of the reason is that the domestic economy is cooling down, employment's going to come down. But the one thing I would stress is that unemployment rates in Canada are going to remain low. I think the unemployment rate in Canada is probably going to come up about 1 percentage point, which would basically take us into the low 7s, which is actually quite low by historical standards. Now, the labor market is an interesting dilemma to talk about when you're talking to small businesses, or small and medium-sized businesses, because in recent years, when I went across the country from Halifax to Vancouver, everywhere I went, I kept getting the same story, which was, whenever I talked about the labor market, businesses were complaining about the fact they couldn't find and retain high-skilled workers, that the market was so tight that they were having high staff turnovers. Well, if you want a silver lining, it's that the labor market won't be as tight as it was. This would imply wage pressures will be less. It would also suggest that you are probably going to find retention less of a problem during a slightly weaker economic time. The housing market in Canada is also cooling down. This is a big part of the story of why the domestic economy is cooling down. The reality is the Canadian housing market was too hot. We went from 2002 to 2007, the average annual price growth in real estate in Canada was 10% per annum. The historical average, long-term sort of trend rate that you can support is 4%. So affordability was getting eroded by rapid home price growth. Eventually the market was going to have to cool down. The question was it going to be a nice orderly cooling down, or was it going to be more abrupt? And you may remember when I came and I talked to you last year, I stressed that the GTA housing market was going to be cooling down, but we weren't going to see the same sort of distress that we're seeing in the United States. Well, this is what's happened. Home prices have cooled down because what's happened is we went from a seller's market in a lot of regions into very balanced market conditions. In case of parts of Western Canada, we're actually in a buyer's market. In Edmonton, Calgary, that's where we're seeing actually significant price declines. But in much of the rest of the country, markets have become much more balanced as a result of significant increases in new listings, lots of new properties coming on the marketplace, at the same time that the demand has been weakening and affordability was stretched. So we have seen prices come down this year. Home prices in Canada are on track for a 2% decline. Now keep in mind, this is after about a 48% run-up. So 2% decline this year, probably a 4 to 5% decline next year, but with the bulk of that decline coming from Western Canada, where you had the most outsized price gains. In the GTA, we think home prices are probably going to be flat to down maybe 1 or 2%. Because what's going to happen is, and this is where I want to reiterate that message, that the housing market cooling in Canada is not like the United States. The US market was driven by speculation. The Canadian marketplace was driven by good affordability. The US marketplace, there was a huge amount of inappropriate lending going on. In Canada, the subprime housing mortgage market was only 5% of all new mortgages in 2006, and it was only 2% of the entire mortgage market outstanding in Canada. In the United States, the ratio was 25% of all new mortgages were subprime. In the United States, they had adjustable rate mortgages where you took out the product, and 2 years after you took out the mortgage, your mortgage rate could double. And this is why a lot of Americans are losing their houses, because their mortgage rate just doubled and they can't afford it. In the Canadian context, we never introduced products like that. One of the products that did stretch out the housing boom and might have contributed to the excess on the pricing side was the introduction of 35 and 40-year mortgages. But holders of those mortgages don't wake up one day and find out their mortgage rates have suddenly jumped unless the Bank of Canada starts raising rates. And the debate right now is not about whether interest rates are going up. The question is, how low are they going to go? So fundamentally, the housing market in Canada, completely different than United States. And you can even see the behavior in the direction of causation. In the United States, the U.S. had a housing bubble. It burst. It's driving them into recession, ultimately. The Canadian housing market, what we had was the market got overheated in the sense that affordability became a problem. The Canadian economy cooled down, and now that's slowing down real estate. In other words, real estate is following the economic cycle just the way you'd expect. So ultimately, economic growth in Canada is going to be very, very weak. Back in August, our numbers basically showed very little or no growth over the next 4 quarters. I think ultimately it's going to be a little worse than that. The Bank of Canada is forecasting 0.6% growth for next year. Our forecast was 1.2 back in August. You know what? We're going to be coming down to the Bank of Canada mark. Growth this year is probably going to be about 0.6%. Next year, probably about 0.6%. They're probably somewhere in there as a quarterly contraction at some point. Basically, the Canadian economy has stalled. And ultimately, the economy will recover when the global financial shock finally abates, when the U.S. economy turns, and when the global economy improves. And again, my intuition is that's probably the second half of 2009, not the first half. Regionally, we are going to see very different growth rates. Western Canada continuing to outperform. Weakest part of the Ontario, the weakest part of Canada being Central Canada. So Ontario is probably in recession. Now here comes a question for you: does it feel like a recession? I don't know about you. I mean, I remember the 1990-91 recession. Right? I'd go sit in a Tim Hortons, I'd have a cup of coffee, and by the time you finished the cup of coffee, you would realize that half the people in the Tim Hortons were there because they didn't have a job to go to. That felt like a recession. If you go to Windsor, Ingersoll, Oshawa, North Bay, Thunder Bay, that's what it feels like. In other words, manufacturing-heavy towns, blue-collar towns in Ontario, heavily export-oriented, particularly in the United States. You know, these cities are in distress because of very weak economic times. However, if you go to places like Richmond Hill, Markham, Kitchener-Waterloo, Ottawa, what you find is it doesn't feel like times are that bad. And again, this is largely an indication of the fact that the domestic side of the Canadian economy is growing at 2%, but the exporters are bearing the brunt of the weakness. And quite frankly, that's going to remain the case until the economy turns. Inflation is a question that we often get raised. Inflation is dead. Don't worry about it. Because ultimately, and we've been trying to tell people this for at least the last year, that as the global economy slowed down, as the weakness in the United States was felt, the weakness on the economy would basically ensure that price pressures would dissipate. And now, the fear that high energy prices would pass through have disappeared as well. Right? Gasoline prices, well, actually, when I filled up today at 99 cents. Out towards Hamilton. So gasoline prices have come way down. The pullback in commodity prices is a big issue for commodity exporters. It's actually going to be a positive for a lot of other businesses. So inflation is not going to be a worry. That's why the Bank of Canada cut rates this week by a 1/4 point. Now we were disappointed. We were hoping they were going to go a 1/2 point, but the Bank of Canada said in their decision that further monetary stimulus would likely be required. That's central bank speak for we're going again. And the next date is in early December. So we'll see the other 1/4 point, it'll come in December. So short-term interest rates are going to come down, probably at least another 1/4 point. If the economy is weaker than we anticipate, and the bank thinks that growth is going to be well below 0.6%, then the bank's going to keep cutting. They'll probably cut another 1/2 point if required. So the central bank will do whatever is required to respond to the economic environment. But as I said, really it isn't a change in short-term interest rates by the Bank of Canada that matters. What really matters is whether we finally see the strain in the global financial system abate. So in other words, what we really need to see is the interbank lending rates coming down. We need to see signs that credit is flowing again, and I think that will come. And the last thing I want to stress again is the difference between the Canadian and the U.S. financial systems, because I find that a lot of clients I talk to, they're reading the headlines, they're reading what's going on in the press, and they have very deep concerns as to the health of the Canadian banking system. Well, I can tell you the Canadian banking system is absolutely solid. The balance sheets for Canadian financial institutions are in good shape. The lending practices of Canadian banks is far more conservative than a lot of the other countries. This is why you have not seen financial failures in Canada. But the Canadian financial system is getting affected adversely by the fact that the interbank lending rates have come up. This is why we've had announcements recently from the Government of Canada in terms of the ability to sell, for Canadian banks to sell $25 billion worth of pooled mortgages to the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which is just means selling them to the U.S. or to the Canadian government. What that does is it's intended that you basically could sell mortgages to the Canadian government and get short-term cash for them. In other words, that helps you basically borrow at a cheaper rate than you could before. And all of the mortgages that are sold to the CMHC are prime loans. There is absolutely no subprime loans in the pool. And the second thing is that the mortgages, the only risk to the government would be if those mortgages turn out to be bad. But you know what? The program is designed that the only mortgages that you can sell to them are the ones that carried a government insurance policy to start with. They were all CMHC approved. So, in other words, the Government of Canada is taking no risk. It is not costing the taxpayer a single cent. But what it is doing is it's helping take strain off the financial system. This week, you heard the Canadian government step forward and say that they were going to provide a guarantee to debt being issued by Canadian banks. Again, it's the sort of announcement that could raise questions about, well, why are they doing it if the system's healthy? The reason is because banks in the US and in Europe now have government guarantees. So now imagine a situation where you have a company like, well, let's just take an example of something like ING, a Dutch bank that has a government guarantee. ING goes to borrow in the marketplace, a Canadian bank goes to borrow in the marketplace. The ING says, I want to borrow from you, and you know what? The government guarantees you're going to get your money back and your interest. Canadian financial institution says, I want to borrow from you, and all I can tell you is I got a good balance sheet. Who's going to borrow at a cheaper rate? Right? So in order to ensure that the Canadian financial system was competitive with its international counterparts, that's why the government made the announcement about the government guarantees that they're going to provide. And in fact, they're making the banks pay for it because they're treating it as an insurance policy. So the banks have to pay in order to get the government guarantee, whereas in the other countries, they just get it for free. So ultimately, the thing I want to stress to you is, I regret to say that the next 3 to 4 quarters could be a choppy road. It could be a difficult time. It's certainly not going to be as good as we had. I do ultimately believe that the tide will turn. It will turn when the global economy starts to recover, because fundamentally the Canadian economy is sound, but ultimately we cannot divorce ourselves from these international trends. So with that, I'll thank you for your time and attention.
Messages, so I guess we all can be prepared for it. Now is the Q&A questions. Should you have any questions?
That's global economy. What's the timeline we're looking into?
Okay. That's a great question. To be honest, the crystal balls are a bit cracked and quite cloudy at the moment. I can tell you I go back to the office and I shake it vigorously. I yell at it to speak to me, and the answer is no one knows. If I did know, I'd be on my 100-foot yacht in the Cayman Islands, because I can tell you, given how big the market decline has been, there's going to be a phenomenal amount of profits to be made when the market does turn. But what I can say is that ultimately I am convinced that when we get 12 months from now, you will see a very different environment than what we have today. The issue is that the governments have thrown, as I said, trillions and trillions of dollars to address the problem. And financial markets today are still sinking. Right, when I left the office, the Toronto Stock Exchange was down more than 300 points. Now, given the volatility in the market, I have no idea what it's at this moment. But the market is continuing to sink because it's worrying about what's coming. But the fact of the matter is, if you give some time, once the government money starts to flow, keep in mind, in order to buy up the bad loans in the United States, first the U.S. government has to create an institution that's going to manage the money. Then they've got to figure out what price they're going to pay to buy up the then they've actually got to go out and do it. So this is the sort of thing in my mind that could take, it could take 3 months to get the program up and running, and it could take another 3 or 6 months to actually implement it. And if we go back and think about the savings and loan crisis in the United States, that's sort of the timeline that they had then. It took like 6 to 9 months for the government programs to really be operating fully. And so that's why I think that the big issue is that